We are officially live right now with Anthony Fantano, internet's most available music nerd, apparently. And it's a pleasure having you on, bro. I mean, we've been wanting to do this for a long time, and we're going to be running through a bunch of different albums, including Kanye West, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, Nothing Was the Same by Drake, Lil Pump by Lil Pump. And let's get it started with My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, one of the most iconic albums of the 2010s, massive comeback album for Kanye. Has your opinion changed over the years? Because you did your Redux review and you said, fuck it, I'm keeping the 6.
Yeah, I mean, I've done videos on my main channel where I readily acknowledge that there are albums that my opinion has changed on. I'm not like beyond having my opinion changed on certain records.
Which is a very good thing, though, because like I feel like if you're going to drop a review, you know, like times do change and like music is always constantly in evolution.
Opinions are based on your own perception and experience and just like things that you've taken in. And, you know, sometimes the way a reception on a record, you know, pans out can impact the way that you feel about it. But yeah, this is an album that still to this day I just think is a little overhyped. I mean, it has its highlights, but I think it has its lowlights as well. And, you know, I get it, you know, because of its greatest moments, which I do think are great. People are enamored with it, and that's great and that's fine. But I just don't think it's an album that is like track for track flawless.
You think it's the second half where you sort of see a bit of a dip? Because I do think that like when you go to Blame Game, when you go to Hell of a Life, obviously those songs are not the caliber of something like a Runaway or a Devil in a New Dress. But I do think that overall as a track list, just that idea of Kanye West kind of giving everyone this backhanded apology to the media, to Taylor Swift, whoever was involved with everything that had gone on prior, that mixed in with the concept of like the American dream and how you can kind of get sucked in and trying to kind of keep your soul intact while going through all the pitfalls that fame come with. I feel like that concept itself was genius, but I guess you don't think the execution of it was handled properly, maybe.
No, I just don't really think that they're great songs. And, you know, I think there's an argument to be made that like, you know, production-wise, progression-wise, the Cudi track is a little one-dimensional. I think that the mastering on All of the Lights could be better. I know that those sound like ridiculous opinions
he managed
to
get
some people.
14 vocalists on that song and make it sound pretty good.
It's true.
I know, but that was my thing too, is that like, I understand where you're coming from with let's say that bottom half. And like, let's say I went back to All of the Lights before this episode and tried to listen to the master over again to like, you had said that it sounded really compressed and that it didn't sound good to the ears. And then you weren't a big fan of Gorgeous as well. For certain reasons, but my thing was more of the score of the 6, you know, and going down to that means it's a passable album for you to a certain extent. So how did you decide to grade that? Because like you look at those last 3 tracks, obviously, you know, they, as Lou said, they don't stack up with the rest of that track list. But was it enough to knock it down that much for you? Like, yeah, exactly.
In my opinion, yes. I mean, like with that record, like with anything else, I have to kind of average it out just based on just the number of tracks and how much I enjoy each one individually and how I feel like they come together as a whole. Okay. There are some kind of track lists that are difficult. For example, if you have a song on a record that is abnormally large in comparison with everything else on the album, but that is not one of those records. When I'm talking about that, I'm talking about like, you know, you have an album of like standard size tracks, but then maybe one track is like 28 minutes or some stuff like that. You know, in that sense, it can be really difficult to kind of do, you know, a track list average. But in the case of My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, that was just kind of a standard scoring deal, just like with any other record for me.
Is there anything from that review that you look back on, or because I know you had done the Redux for the 2 million subscriber mark. By the way, congratulations on all the success of the channel and everything that's happened.
Thanks.
Big fucking trailblazer, at least in the music commentary, you know, section of entertainment. But just talking about that review, like, do you ever go back to that review and be like, you know, maybe I gave that master a second listen and I find it's better. Maybe I went back to a couple of Kanye lines on Runaway and decided, hey, this line doesn't knock it down as it's supposed to be. You know, did that happen, let's say, over the past 2 years since you've dropped that Redux?
You know, my most of my regrets with that review, along with the Damn review as well, I wish I had just gone a little bit harder, you know, and on some of the points that I had, which is why I did the Redux in the first place, because there was like, you know, I wasn't displeased with my feelings on the record, but I was displeased with how surface level some of the comments I was making was. And I felt like I could have gone into more detail, which is why I'm much happier with how the Redux came out in terms of like why I'm feeling certain ways that I did on certain tracks, you know? So yeah, you know, I feel like when like the temptation is there to kind of talk forever about certain things, because you could talk about, you could like unpack, you know, a piece of art until the end of time, you know, and just like sort of be going on and on and on and on and on. You know, at some point you do have to leave some stuff on the cutting room floor, and you can't sort of like, you know, you sort of like ruin the digestibility of the review if you're just like kind of going literally like line by line, this line sucks, this line's great, this line sucks, this line's great, you know what I mean? So after a while you do have to like kind of cut your losses and sort of, you know, only dig into things at a certain level, if depending on how you want to make it. I mean, if you want that to sort of be your thing and you want to have a 6-hour video, you know, covering My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, I mean, go ahead and do it. That could, you know, that could be really ambitious and amazing. But you know, at a certain point I had to, you know, sort of stop digging and just sort of like say enough was enough. And yeah, you know, I feel like, especially when it comes to a review that people are like constantly questioning me on, you know, it does sometimes just make me want to just say even more to kind of like back up my opinion if I am still feeling that way, Absolutely,
because emotions change over time. And I think that especially as like music commentators, I mean, like you can relate to this too. Like you'll never ever get it perfect, you know, just because, as you were mentioning before, you know, your thoughts are in constant evolution, right? Like maybe tomorrow you wake up and like the 6 goes to a 10. Who knows, right?
Who
like
knows?
I don't think so at this point.
But
Listen, I do have some takes for you. Do you think that the production on the album is one of the best produced albums of the 2010s? Because when you're looking at how like maximalist it is, when you're looking at, you know, these highlight moments like Mike Dean's genius guitar solo on Devil in a New Dress, when you're looking at the extravagance of a beat like Power and the progressive rock sample that's kind of introduced in there, like is that something that you really hold to a high stature in terms of just that production? You do?
No, I think the production on the album is on the highlights especially is very good.
Okay.
You know, it's kind of hard to. It's interesting how you guys kind of see the album in that way in terms of like its time span, because obviously, like I remember when Kanye first popped off. I remember hearing him since like The College Dropout. I remember hearing his every progression and evolution since then. And I vividly remember the era of hip hop that he sort of stood out in as being very unique. And I see that record almost less like an album that I'm like, oh yeah, this is like one of the best albums of the 2010s, even though technically like in a way it is, just because of the decade in which it dropped. But like, I see that album almost as like, not even so much like one of the best of the 2010s, but almost like the door closing on the bling era. And just sort of like, this is like all of the extravagance of all of that put in its most like opulent form that I possibly can. And like, here it is. And to me, that's like the chapter kind of closing on that record for me. And since that album, to me, hip hop production has just like, you know, expanded and, you know, grown by leaps and bounds. You know, because like to me, yeah, the production on that album is great, but simultaneously I'm also really blown away by the production on T-Pab. You know, I'm like blown away by the production on a lot of records that would come out, you know, just years after that album. So, I mean, yeah, it is good. It is impressive. I think there are a lot of albums production wise I prefer to it, and you know, T-Pab is one, but like, you know, the others that I would cite are probably not like, you know, maybe people wouldn't put up against My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy in terms of like how appealing it is in an aesthetic way, in a traditional sense. Like obviously Twisted Fantasy is the more beautiful record, but like I personally get more out of an album like Atrocity Exhibition from Danny Brown. Like I love the ugliness of that record. I love the hideousness of that record. I love how jittery and glitchy and overwhelming Death Grip sounds in comparison to My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. You know what I mean? But there are a lot of like big budget sounding beautiful Jay-Z tracks and records in the 2000s that, like, be it on Blueprint or be it on Black Album and so on and so forth, that obviously, like, Kanye kind of leapt over that in a way with Dark Twisted Fantasy, but yeah, I think I just sort of see the album in a greater context. It's like there are more experimental, adventurous albums aesthetically that came after that I think are more interesting to me personally. Yeah. And I think that there are Bling era albums that also had fairly big budgets and a lot of instrumental ambition that, maybe weren't quite as far reaching because Kanye had, sort of like the vision that they didn't. But, it's not an album that's it's not an island. It didn't happen in a vacuum. You know what I mean?
For sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I have another question for you, just, based on the whole MBDTF era. Kanye West is obviously known for his discography, right? And the different eras that transpired within the progression of his music and how he released projects over the years. And you were saying something earlier too about how, people regard it as one of the decade's best because of when it was dropped within that decade. So, like, how did, do you think, like, time affected that album and, like, your perception of it? And where does it stand alone, let's say, within Kanye's discography for you? Do you think it's in still the top tier regardless of the rating? Do you think maybe it's middle tier or maybe one of your least favorite? How do you see My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy?
Regardless of my rating, I still think it's a top tier record for him. I probably wouldn't track for track, pound for pound, I probably wouldn't rate 808 super high either, but I still think it's one of his better records just because of like what it kind of hit upon, what I mean? As you were kind of saying earlier, like, people saw Dark Twisted Fantasy as like his comeback album in a way, but that's only because of like the bad reception of the album that people would only go on to appreciate more in retrospect. You know what I mean? So it's like, I guess what I'm trying to say here is like it's all relative to the reception of the time that the album drops.
Yeah, and I agree with that, because the thing is that, like, obviously it depends where you're at in that moment, where you're listening to it, what type of environments you're bringing that soundtrack in. So for you, like, how were you listening to that album back then? Was it more in party settings, let's say? Was it more with your friends? Was it more personal listenership? Like, how did you treat that album?
Just personal listening, honestly. Like I for stuff that I would review, it was mostly just like around that time, especially, it was mostly just like personal listening. That time span, I was like, most, if not all of the work that I was doing and listening to new records was just like completely by myself, because like a lot of my free time, if time outside of that was spent either like occasionally hanging out with my friends, but I was also working at a pizza restaurant. I was cooking pizza. Fire. And I was working at an NPR station doing like announcing and stuff. Yeah. And like, that's where like a lot of my days and work days were sort of spent. And then, whatever free time that I had for other people, on occasion was with them, but also I just spent a lot of time just sinking it into this, just to like get it off the ground. You know what I mean? And I had, friends of mine that didn't necessarily like, at least in person anyway, didn't have super strong opinions on Kanye. I had a lot of my friends who I still kept in contact with, either from my college station or just my personal life, who turned me on to other genres of music, didn't have super strong Kanye opinions. Wow. So I was like, just kind of basing that just on my own personal experience at the time. I had friends of mine on the internet who also were like kind of music nerd types and, were in like music forums and stuff, who I was, in communication with the record. But my experience with it personally was kind of a very singular one, but that's not really unique. That's kind of the case for a lot of the records that I review time to time. Yeah. If I end up kind of having a context for the album, among other people, because maybe they're listening to it, maybe we're talking about it, so on and so forth, it's usually after my review has come out, because a lot of the time, I will just kind of like avoid, and because it's kind of taken off in the way that it has, a lot of my friends will be like, oh, I've been listening to this, but I won't tell you what I think about it yet. not until your review is out. Yeah. Okay. And, these days I'm not so much like, don't tell me your opinion. I don't want to, it's like, I'm afraid you might change my mind. I don't so much have that attitude about it anymore, but I do find it very funny how, careful some people try to be, or how respectful, they try to be when maybe they have an opinion on something and, they've just heard a record that I'm about to review, but I haven't come out with a video about it yet. And they're just like, can I tell you what I think? Is it okay if I share it it with you. So yeah.
But it's kind of inevitable. I feel like if someone's kind of showing you a song and making you listen to it a different way, pointing out a certain chord progression or whatever the case may be, for you to kind of digest it differently, maybe view it differently as well. And with My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, I mean, I think it still does remain one of the most iconic of that decade. I think it has some of the best features of all time. Rick Ross, Nicki Minaj, how much she put into that verse, how energetic she was in terms of the different accents, the grunting, the moaning. I just think that there are a lot of highlight moments. I think it's also one of the most theatrical albums of the 2010s.
Sure.
But yeah, definitely respect your opinion. Let's move on though to Swimming by Mac Miller. And this is a very interesting album. Your rating of it kind of took me aback when I first saw it, because I thought this one of the best albums of 2018. I thought that Mac
Did you listen to the
Miller's-
album when it dropped?
I did.
Yes,
I
I
heard
did,
it
yeah.
right after it dropped, and I was blown away by the concept of Mac Miller wanting to kind of keep his head above the water, him trying to want to swim to shore, and really just looking for a second chance. I mean, he was going through a super low point in his life. He had just broken up with Ariana Grande, going through his substance abuse issues, but he was kind of bringing this optimism with this album that was really amazing to me. So,
Absolutely.
for you, listening to the album now, has any opinions changed for you? How do you feel about it right now?
That is a record that I am going to probably do a video on at some point.
Really?
I am planning on doing a revisitation of that record. And yeah, you know, a lot of my opinions on the singing quality of the LP like still stand, but as far as like, you know, other things like the production and, you know, the general rapping on the record and the overall concept, like a lot of it has grown on me. I just haven't kind of spoken a lot about it, you know, since, because I'm kind of waiting for that moment, maybe at the end of this year or the start of next year, where I decide to kind of take on like a Redux revisitation where I kind of give some fleshed out, kind of altered thoughts on the album.
Yeah, and I always found that review interesting, just because when you had listened to it, a lot of the stuff that you were saying about it was that, you know, you didn't feel like you were moved by the record, or you felt like as if certain parts fell flat. And I find those points interesting, because once you get to the community sentiment about it, and, you know, in music, we always like to have our own opinions and obviously, you know, be subjective about things. But there was a huge sentiment around the community that this album was a big aid for people, where it made them feel something, where it made them, you know, feel like they had Mac Miller and, like, let's say, their own listenership with them, you know, guiding them through, let's say, life's problems.
Kind of a therapy session.
Exactly.
With
So
Mac.
like, you know, as you've been able to grow with the record, have you picked up on those types of sentiments, let's say, you know, with your personal listenership with it, or let's say going back to the record?
I would say, you know, obviously those sentiments rung through even more intensely on Circles.
Absolutely.
You know, when I reviewed that, I mean, you know, like it just obviously his passing puts everything in perspective. You know what I mean? So, I mean, you have to kind of like do a double back on everything that was said, just like everybody did, because, you know, truth be told, when I did the review, like obviously it didn't get like super strong positive reactions because it's a negative review. But, you know, those reactions were mostly localized to a lot of his most hardcore fans. Like, you know, Swimming is not one of Mac Miller's poppiest records, one of his catchiest records. If we're talking about in terms of like pure numbers and the cultural splash that it made, you know, Movies and Good AM like did much better by him in terms of like, you know, the attention that the biggest singles off those records garnered,
Like
because they were
like Objects in the Mirror, stuff like that.
because they were much more accessible songs. Like, you know, this track or this record and Divine Feminine were not super commercially successful eras for Mac. So, you know, unfortunately, like a lot of the conversation around those albums were localized to his most hardcore fans. And at the time, while they weren't happy with my sentiments on the record, like the conversation mostly kind of remained there, and then it just kind of came and went. It was like any other album that I didn't really care for. But then obviously he passed, and I feel like that caused not only his fans, but everybody who was like kind of just casually into Mac Miller, people who had never even heard of him before and were just like, who is this guy, you know, that everybody's talking about, and, you know, and you know, passed away so tragically. His passing caused this like huge, you know, reanalyzation of the record that then sort of like caused more people to look at the review, who are just like, oh, what does he say about this album that I'm listening to now? It's like, what, are you kidding me? And so now it's like, you know, I had obviously no control or sort of like say over whether or not that review or that album would be his last, you know what I mean? So it's like, because of the way that the internet kind of like collapses everything down in terms of timeline. People are hearing the album for the first time with obviously like his story, his passing, and all of that in mind and in context, and then looking at my review as if I had literally just made these statements 5 minutes ago. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like,
and that's all up to chance, though. You know, at the end of the day, like obviously things that happened with that record.
Sure.
And I think, you know, at least from my personal relatability factor with the record, when Mac Miller had passed, he was still, you know, one of my favorite artists. And I come up listening to stuff like Kids with my cousin. I was listening to Faces. I was in a bunch of different of Mac Miller's projects. And I remember it came out on the same night as Astroworld, and I was listening to Swimming, and I was like, I feel like this is the best record that came out that night. Like I was really drawn in by it. And then once that event had happened, you start to realize how real the content matter was, and you start to realize like the emotional depths that record could even bring you to. So I feel like that's, you know, how the record grew on me. Like, how about you, for like you, Lou, like especially that you're such a big fan of the record, do you feel like that was a big playing part in the way that you then analyzed the album and the way that you went into your next listenings with it?
To be honest, for me, it never really affected me that much, in the sense that like from the first few listens, I kind of already understood where he was at mentally. I understood that he was going through a tough time and that it was a very tumultuous period in his life. But again, it goes back to just that optimism that he shows in certain records on here. But I mean, going back to what you said about how experimental it was, I think that he really, you know, draws a fine line between different subgenres. Trip hop, for example. He also did a lot of jazz rap stuff on this album. And I do want to pick your brain about the singing, because I do think that like how subdued he is, how low key and moody he sounds, it does kind of fit the aesthetic of the album. Because if someone is, you know, let's say in a depressive state of mind while making an album, you can't expect them, let's say, to sound too animated or too hyper. So I feel like that subdued kind of vocal tone that he has was fitting. And I also feel like he never oversteps. He never kind of gives you these grace notes. He's always kind of playing within his comfortable vocal range. And I did appreciate that out of it. But what about you? Like, what was it about the singing specifically that
it's
like?
more his technical chops than it is just kind of the delivery, you know, but he's more of a rapper than a singer, you know what I mean? And that's also the case for Kanye, you know what I mean? But he and him and other artists as well have just kind of like thrown caution to the wind and said, listen, I'm obviously not the greatest singer, but I'm just going to do it just because I feel like this emotion needs to be expressed through me, as opposed to, you know, some other artist or a guest feature or whatever. And that's a choice that obviously I'm not like crazy about. I'm a critic. I'm going to be nitpicky about everything, especially if I think like something technically speaking is kind of falling short. But you know, that's not to say that other sort of aspects of a record don't close the gap. In fact, like, you know, there are other things that you could do to sort of like compensate for, you know, a lack of either singing ability or, you know, technical ability on any instrument. You know what I mean? Like some of the best songs out there don't really have a lot of technical prowess to them at their core. And they're just like really well written, catchy songs, or they just like deliver a very powerful sentiment of some sort. Absolutely. So, you know, not everything comes down to technical ability in all cases. But in that instance, it, you know, it's a record that falls short for me in that sense. But I think like over the years that has not sort of like maintained as big of a factor in my mind as the other aspects of the record. And that's the thing, like there can be aspects of an album that maybe I don't like when I first hear it and I continue to not enjoy, and sort of like, you know, they just remain to be an aspect of the album that I don't care for and I don't like. But maybe there are other characteristics of the record that end up growing on me over the years that maybe I first thought were just okay or were pretty good, but end up, you know, just becoming endearing to me with sort of like continued exposure or whatever.
Yeah, and that's something I wanted to ask you too, is like when you're doing these reviews, obviously there's a lot of weighting that goes into place. There's a lot of analyzation. What do you look for out of a record? Because like example, for Swimming, you were saying how, you know, the singing fell flat and all that, you know, type of conversation. But let's say like a record has, you know, all right singing and like you're really nitpicking on that, but it has fantastic production, or let's say it has a lot of energy coming out of different rapping performances. How do you weigh those different things into getting your final score at the end of the day? You know, like what came down to that final score for Swimming for you?
You know, it depends on like whether or not I feel like a certain aspect of a track ruins the entire song, you know, or sort of like makes the song less appealing overall. And that's kind of what I was getting at earlier. You know, it's like there are other aspects of the songs that I'm appreciating more. And as a result of that, I am able to kind of enjoy them even with maybe some technical flaws that I'm still noticing. Okay. And there are other artists, you know, outside of the heart, you know, the hip hop genre that, you know, I think like apply. You know, one of my favorite singer-songwriters whose records I was just kind of enjoying the other day, his name is Jonathan Richman. Okay. He's a Boston-based guy. But like by no means, I think, would anybody call this man like a great singer. You know, he's kind of not only is his pitch control like not the strongest, but like his very deep voice and delivery kind of lends itself to almost like a bit of goofiness. Yeah. However, you know, the guy plays into there's an earnestness as well to the way that he sings and the fact that he is so kind of raw and vulnerable in a lot of his tracks. And he also makes really strong use of like humor on his songs to sort of get a point across. One of his most popular songs is called Dancing in a Lesbian Bar. And the whole track is about how he was at some random bar on a Friday night and it was boring and not cool and nothing was going on. But then one of his friends said, hey, if you want to dance and have a great time, come with me. And then they brought him to a lesbian bar. And he's like saying things like, at this bar, things were uptight, but now these things in this bar are, you know, Friday night, and, you know, so on and so forth. So, you know, when you have kind of those maybe like, you know, weak points of your voice, or you have, you know, sort of like an aspect of something that you can't quite get over, you know, sometimes that can be a strength depending on like what your delivery is or what the sentiment is.
Absolutely.
You know?
And I think that's quite interesting just because like obviously music is in constant evolution for different artists, right? So like maybe the album and the track list becomes more production prominent, or let's say it becomes more prominent on the artist singing, depending on whatever it is. So I do agree, like having to narrow it down, because even when I'm doing my reviews with Lou, it gets hard sometimes because you're like, wow, like, you know, this was great, but this wasn't that great. So like, where do I find that middle ground for it? So
it's kind of the case. Yeah. I feel like with all art, there's always so many components to kind of, you know, dissect at the end of the day. And what outweighs what? Is production more valuable than singing on the album? Like there's so much to kind of consider. But yeah, with Swimming, I'm happy that you're kind of like maybe evolving with the album and having a bit of a different take on it. So it's cool to see. Next up, we have Lil Pump by Lil Pump. And this is an album that I'm really not a big fan of. All right? I think if you're to count, you maybe have for each song maybe 10 unique words per fucking song.
Probably, yeah.
Not only that, but like I was mentioning to you before the recording that like if it wasn't for this fucking episode, I wasn't going to read through that. Like I'm sorry, you know, it's tough, man.
Dreadful.
Yeah.
You know, what's funny is like people act like I'm the biggest fan of it. I just merely think it's a fun album to listen to.
Which is, in all fairness, which is really
still bumping it today.
Like some tracks, yeah. Some tracks I think whenever some people bring it up are like, you're an idiot for liking that. But you know, it's funny because there's so many artists out there that just make really dumb, materialistic, just like, you know, it's not supposed to be highbrow music. Yeah. And I feel like I'm constantly like, you know, having people jump up my ass, just being like, you're being too dismissive toward this. You're being too dismissive toward, not everything needs to be deep. And it's like, okay, here's quite possibly the dumbest thing that you can listen to. I think it's pretty fun. I think it's so dumb. It's actually kind of unique. It's so stupid. So I mean,
kind of mind-numbing music, you could say.
Right, exactly. Right? Well, I actually think it's kind of funny how stupid it is, honestly. And that's like, you know, the kind of the entertainment value of it in a way. It's you know, it's not the same thing because you know, I think especially during their breakout era, you know, Migos had, you know, a lot more artistry going for them. But like, I sort of see a lot of those tracks on the Pump album as like, you know, listening to Versace. You know, it's like you're literally just Versace. Like, how far off is that from like Gucci Gang?
But the verses are way more, you know.
No, it's true.
I would say
it's true.
Good
it's true
on Versace.
But in terms of like just like being tongue in cheek and kind of absurd and just like really repetitive for the sake of being repetitive, you know, it's like that was the marker of a lot of trap music during that era.
It was. It definitely was.
Not only with that, but like Lil B, for example, as well. Yeah. You know, it's like, let's just make the simplest, most repetitive thing that we can come up with and just see like if it becomes an earworm. You know what I mean? And
but I think that was the case for Pump, though, is that it ended up becoming an earworm for a lot of people just because of how simplistic the writing was. And like, I don't even know if there was any writing on the fucking album
exactly.
within the creation of this. So I mean, at the end of the day,
Is the production a saving grace for you?
no,
Ant, at all?
no. Listen, let me talk about this fucking production, all right? Because like I remember, coming up and like listening to this record. I've had experience with this, and like listening to it. Let's say at house parties that we were at. It was like our final year of high school, getting into college. It was prominent. It was actually a prominent record, whether people like to fucking admit it or not.
Listen, I think it's like the production of the album in general. Like, look, I'm not going to put it against My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy or anything like that. But as far as like that distorted, aggressive, bassy SoundCloud era that it came out of, I feel like it's one of the best. Like, and you could say what you want about that era. There were a lot of great artists that came out of that era. Rico Nasty.
Oh, I'm not saying that I hate the era.
No, I'm not saying you are either. Okay. I'm just defending the era in general.
Yeah.
I'm saying in terms of like, it may not be one of the best produced albums ever, but if you're looking for an album that like quantifies or sort of like, reduces down like what the vibe of that was production wise, I feel like that's one of the records. I feel like that's one of the most aesthetically defining records of that sound and of that era.
Yeah. Especially like, let's say within all of the bass and like 808s that are putting it through, like you listen to it in your headphones and you're like, geez, the 808s are clipping so hard that I kind of want to take this out of my mixing headphones. It becomes so much to a certain point that I feel like it's overbearing. But let me ask you something.
And it's almost like you hear that beat once and you heard it like for every single song after that. You know what I mean? I feel
I'm not sure though. You see, like that's where
there's
I'm gonna
not that much diversity in sound in that album,
with you.
bro.
Like if you take something like Gucci Gang, I'm gonna do like a bit of devil's advocate. I'm gonna actually defend this album a bit.
I mean, there is some variety from Gucci Gang too. If you jump over to Boss and you hear those like revving up, are they square waves in the synthesizer? Either way, it's like a very sort of rough synth. It's like it's like that. That's like a very ear grabbing sound.
It is an ear grabbing sound, and I feel like also when it comes to live performances, a lot of people do enjoy this album. Like, I can remember seeing the videos of like the mosh pits and like all the people that enjoy this album live, and I think it strives great there. But I wanted to jump more into the actual score of it, okay? Because you gave it. Listen,
it's a 7.
It's a 7. You gave it a 7, and
which means I thought it was pretty good. I liked it,
but. Let's play a bit of compare and contrast.
It's not KD3. It's not KD3.
We've been talking about like looking at the strengths of a record, okay? Right. To me, throughout this entire album, he can't shift gears. Yeah. He's kind of stuck with like kind of somewhat catchy, annoying hooks, very basic melodies, not the most animated. I feel like a lot of like that chaotic and hyper feeling that you might get from the tracks do come from the production. So to me, it's like I listen to Lil Pump and I feel like there's nothing that he does that another rapper can do better.
No, it's true. The thing is like, for me, the album overall is just like about vibe. Okay. I know it's a one-dimensional one in a sense. Like there are compositionally and lyrically very basic punk albums that I would probably give about a 7 or so that like hit in a similarly visceral sense where it's like, it's aggressive, it's blunt, it's in your face, it's simple, it kind of gets you really hyped up. It gets the blood pumping, but like there's not a whole lot of like content to it deeper than that. And while I do give the album and what Lil Pump was doing in terms of like the minimalism of the lyrics and what's going on with the beats aesthetically, I mean, I feel like at least in his case, that was less like, okay, we're going to come up with this unique thing and sort of like, assemble it here and assemble it this way. Like it was not so much a conscious choice. It was more like right time, right place. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like if he had been any other artist during any other time period, if he had arrived 3 years later than he did, like there would be no reason to talk about Lil Pump whatsoever. Yeah. Like there really truly would not be.
And it was also the way that artists were marketing themselves at the time. Something that you said that, I agree with in the review is also the whole thing of like, a lot of artists' marketing tactics to drive sales to the album were, getting memed out and like were like, presenting this certain image, especially within that SoundCloud era. But, I want to talk about the score about it again, just because like,
one more thing about the record that I do have to praise it on. Here's one more thing I could suck this record's dick on. Lil Pump, for better or for worse, we talk about the one dimensionality of the record, but Lil Pump and his producers knew his limitations. They knew his limitations because there's so many rappers that break out and they're like, yeah, now we're going to do one for the ladies and we're going to do like a pop track for the radio and we'll do that. And he was like, fuck it. We're just going to do one stupid song, one after another. They're all going to be horribly mastered and produced. So they're all distorted as fuck. And he just played to his audience, and that was it. And the thing is, like, I can respect somebody who could do that. You know, the thing that sucked about the follow-up record, what was it? Harvard
Dropout. By the way, Harvard with an E, I believe.
Yeah, Harvard with an E. On that record, he did not understand his limitations and was like, now we're going to do all of the bells and whistles and stuff that I do not play into well. And that was like, you know, I think ultimately his undoing.
Yeah. And, you know, okay, so this is the ultimate question now. You had Lil Pump at a 7.
Yeah. What are the records I put over it? Yes.
Yeah, but MBDTF was a 6. And I believe you had Swimming as a what? I think it was a 3, right?
Yeah.
So, like, obviously you look at those at face value and, you know, everyone asks, like, you know, what the fuck's going on?
Right.
But I'm sure there's an explanation behind that. So, like, how do you judge score from score? Like, in my opinion,
it's just pure enjoyability.
Okay.
Also, before you go into it, I want to ask you, like, let's say you have Lil Pump at a 7 and Swimming at a 3. Does that automatically mean that you think Lil Pump had put out the better record in comparison to Mac Miller?
I just enjoy the album more.
Enjoy it more.
Okay.
But the thing is, like, that's not to say that I think, like, now here's the thing. If you asked me, like, overall, do I think Lil Pump or Mac Miller or Lil Pump or Kanye is the better artist? Like, obviously I'm going to say Kanye is the better artist. You know what I mean? Like, to me, a great song, just like a great record, can be a fluke. You know what I mean? And I feel like that album, if any album has proven to be a fluke, it's that record.
Definitely.
You know what I mean? And like I was saying earlier, there's a lot of great, you know, also punk albums that are just flukes, because in a lot of those instances, you just had like a bunch of young, dumb kids that had no fucking idea what they were doing. And they just like kind of blah, and they just did it, and they didn't really understand the artistic significance of it all as they were creating it, and how unique or visceral or whatever it would be. And it just kind of happened, and it was this weird lightning in a bottle thing that just occurred due to just the stars aligning at a certain point. Now the thing is, like, regardless of whether or not I enjoy Swimming or My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy more, one thing that you can give those albums over, you know, the Pump self-titled tape, is that those albums at least have intention behind them.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Mac Miller had a very careful like plan and message and emotion that he wanted to get across in that album, whereas like Lil Pump is just kind of like just throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. And just by chance, I think a pretty significant amount of shit stuck to the wall.
That's a good point.
I feel like it was the same singular piece of shit being thrown repeatedly.
Sure. And it was just a particularly sticky substance, you know, just sort of consistency of shit that day. Whereas, like, you know, by that same token, like 6, 7, 10 times more intent probably went into Lupe Fiasco's Lasers, but almost none of that shit was sticking to the wall. You know, so it's like intent isn't always everything, you know, but it can amount to something. And especially if you're a fan of an artist and you're invested in their narrative, in their progression, in sort of the you know, what we say is sort of like the heart that they put in their music. I mean, yeah, as much as I enjoy the Pump tape, probably little to no heart went into that record.
No,
it's just like a dumb, mindless, fun album.
Absolutely. And I think you hear it all the way through. But let's move on to another album, okay?
Sure.
Because we're Canadian, and obviously we're huge fucking Drake fans. I mean, we talk about his music all the time.
I can't believe I'm here. Drake is going to come down the stairs and kill me right now. Is he waiting upstairs?
You know what? Listen, that would be a fire experience, just getting like a talking room with Drake in the corner and like having a whole conversation about his music. But I want to narrow it down to Nothing Was the Same. Okay, because for a lot of the community, this is viewed as his best, you know, piece of work. In my opinion, it is his best album. I think that you're getting Drake at his most focused. I think that when you have to look at each era of Drake, this was the one that accomplished the most as far as what type of material he was giving you, especially if it comes down to lyrical performances on stuff like Tuscan Leather or Furthest Thing, or even, let's say, Pound Cake. But when it came to your review, you didn't feel kind of the same way within that era of Drake. So how do you feel about Nothing Was the Same looking back on it, you know, all these years later? And has the opinion changed on the record?
I think some of the highlights on it still stand out, but I still think Hold On, We're Going Home is one of his corniest tracks. I can't stand it. Yeah, I really can't.
That's
on
like
top of it, like
pop bliss, bro.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't. And on top of it, also Wu-Tang Forever, I think, is one of his most boring and long-winded tracks he's ever done.
I'm a huge Wu-Tang Forever fan.
No, I can't. I feel like that's just one of his many tracks that, in my opinion, I feel like I feel like that album and that era was still marked by, even though he was doing better numbers than he used to, or was at the start of his career, and he really was like coming up pretty rapidly. I still think during that era he was still kind of plagued by the fact that he was not getting the type of respect that he felt like he should have been getting from his peers, from the old guard of hip hop, and just from the genre in general. I mean, that was still an era where Drake's the type of guy type memes were just sort of like, you know, flying left and right across the internet. And, you know, I think, you know, it wouldn't be until like the Meek Mill beef and, you know, the Views era, and if you're reading this, where he really kind of like sealed the deal and became like, you know, legit. I mean, it's probably like a different sentiment in Canada, obviously, but like at least over here in the US, I could sort of sense that like there were a lot of closet Drake fans during the Nothing Was the Same era.
Oh, for sure there was. Like a lot of people weren't able to accept that, you know, rapping singing duality that he brought to the table, that, you know, it's almost
and
a certain
the fact
point
that it's also like emotional, or it's like, you know, it's soft. It's
because like hip hop has always
know,
been portrayed as like a very rough and very rigid sort of, you know, genre within music. So
he's not the first to do that, though. But I think where he excels, especially on Nothing Was the Same, is just that duality and that seamless transition from singing to rapping on a song like Wu-Tang Forever, for example. I feel like you can almost like forget if he's singing or rapping for how intertwined, you know, both vocal techniques are. But Nothing Was the Same, I feel like a lot of people do view it as his best just because it's arguably Drake's most conceptual album. Like even looking at, let's say, the album cover where you see, you know, Drake looking up into the clouds, that's, you know, Drake wanting to be that kid again, wanting to go back to his mother's basement and not have to deal with, you know, all the hardships that come with being at the position that he's in. And I feel like that also plays into the production as well, because you have a lot of, let's say, time warping and warped sounds that kind of bleed into the production, which shows Drake kind of going back and forth from a reminiscing era and where he's at currently in the game. But yeah, I just feel like even when you look at like beat for beat, something like Tuscan Leather, the way that they manipulated that Whitney Houston sample 3 different times, reversed her vocals, like that's some of the best production I've heard of that decade, once again, especially for the mainstream. But what do you think are really the issues technically with Drake in terms of his rapping, in terms of his singing on the album? Like,
I just think it's an underwhelming record. I mean, I will give it to that track. You know, it was a pretty bold, I mean, Tuscan Leather was a pretty bold moment for Drake to sort of open up an album at length in that way, you know, and for him to acknowledge that, like, you know, this is not a radio track and so on and so forth, and kind of kick off his record in that way. Like there are definitely some daring things on the record, but simultaneously there are just moments where I think like it just hit for hit. It's not as, it doesn't go as hard as Take Care, in my opinion. It doesn't go hard as If You're Reading This, in my opinion. Maybe it's something I could revisit and see if it kind of grows on me a little bit more. But yeah, there's just like some key tracks on there that I just don't think are that great. And I think it's a pretty, you know, bloated album as well. Not as bloated as Scorpion.
You mentioned Hold On, We're Going Home.
Yeah.
Does Worst Behavior fall into that that category too? Because I love that
Worst
song.
Behavior has grown on me. Started from the bottom, I think, in terms of sentiment, I still think is a pretty corny song.
Anthem.
Yeah, not for me. Not for me.
Okay.
Sorry, not for me. Not crazy about Own It either. Yeah, I just think it's like it's too,
tries to do a bit too much, maybe.
No, I just think it's a little, I don't think it's a meaty record. I don't think it's a punchy record. You know, one of my most vivid memories of that album is I went to South by the year that album came out.
Yeah.
And I saw this, I forget who it was. There was like really, prominent rap DJ from the 90s, who was spinning a set, and it was like a really fucking crazy good set, and he had the crowd going absolutely wild, like insane. There was even like literally an old school dance circle in the middle of the floor, and people were just like taking turns like stepping in the middle and just like pulling off their moves, and like, you know, people you didn't think could like pull off the wildest shit were just like, you know, doing whatever. I was like, this magic had sort of like, you know, overtaken the venue and everything at this like, you know, sort of downtown venue in Austin. And then like the guy switched like from some 90s shit. He was sort of doing a mix of like b-boy stuff from the 80s and 90s, and like, you know, it was just like a good vibe. It was just a great set. And we were nearing the end of his whole thing, and Nothing Was the Same, I think, came out that week or the week before, if I'm remembering correctly. It was sort of just out recently. And like, he's like, okay, we're going to switch it up. This new Drake record just came out. It's hard. Let's play a track from it. You guys are going to love it. And he started playing it. And then like the circle dissipated and people started taking out their phones and scrolling on Twitter. And it's like, there was no interaction between anybody. It's like all the connection that was there for sort of just a few minutes ago just disappeared and it was gone. Yeah. And it was like, what the fuck happened? I thought this was a party. I thought we were here to have a good time. What is going on? It's
so
like,
you saw firsthand the effects of the record in an actual room.
That's a group of like fucking 10 people. I'm sorry. We're not gonna base like kind of
this is a full venue. This is a shoulder to shoulder packed venue. This is not a group of 10 people. This is like hundreds of people in a venue who are just like, you know, throwing it the fuck down in like the craziest dance circle I've seen since I was a kid. And like, you know, there was just sort of like completely just sucked the wind out of the party. And I just don't think it's like, you know, a very exciting or lively album. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, like, it all comes down to personal, you know, subjectivity at the end of the day, and like what you enjoy and what ends up making throughout your rotation. But that's interesting because it's Lou and I's favorite Drake album. But let's keep going on with this. Okay, let's go on to Lil Yachty's Lil Boat. Okay, so this was an album review that I found quite interesting, just because
great project, great. So I should go back. I should go back and go harder on it. I should give it a 10. No, I'm kidding.
and how do you feel about the record? Because like what you were saying also was that the same thing, kind of the same vibe as Lil Pump, where it's so dumbed down that it's kind of good to a certain extent, and where like it's a really nice feel good record as well, where he's very bubbly.
It's very bright. It's a very positive kind of album. It's a very cheery, almost kind of record. You know, I think Yachty. I really don't know what went on with that. Like, I feel like he had, if he stayed on a certain path, he had like probably 3 or 4 more Lil Boats left in him. But like instead, I feel like, you know, the major labels got to him. The fact that for whatever reason, and there were a lot of artists that came out of that SoundCloud era that were getting a lot of hate, but because of the attention that he was getting, I feel like he got a disproportionate amount of hate.
A lot of unfair criticisms with his music as well, just because like, I don't agree with your score whatsoever. I genuinely don't think that it's a good album all that much, at least for my rotation. Yeah. But people don't give him the credit that he deserves, especially for how dynamic of a rapper that he could possibly be in certain settings, whether it's, you know, the use of auto-tune in certain verses that he uses.
Awful. That use of auto-tune is horrible, man. Like when you're listening to his melodic auto-crooning, it's
more
fucking squeaks in his voice, bro.
His voice and the auto-tune on it combine in a very weird way. I will admit that.
But like it's almost good to a certain extent.
But it's kind of, but it's legitimately. And look, this is a lot like Lil Pump in the sense that it's almost like a stars align kind of moment. You know, it's almost like by chance in a way, because like, you know, it's just kind of a bunch of random factors coming together and somehow creating a really kind of weird, unique experience. But like the way his voice sounds with autotune on, especially in the way that he was like kind of hitting with the inflections that he was on that record, the like, you know, I can tell on his latest records he does not lean into that as much as he did when he came out of the gate. Maybe it's something he's gotten more self-conscious with over the years. Maybe it's something that he decided is just a sound he wanted to move away from. Either way, it combines in a very weirdly almost experimental way that I kind of appreciate.
I think that's the one thing you can kind of give to the record is just the catchiness of some of his melodies, the simplicity of all of it. I mean, to me, it's kind of like bubblegum trap music, like a lot
Minnesota. Like, come on.
Like it's music that you think would be made like for theme songs off of Disney Junior. You know what I mean? Like it's super fucking I would say kid friendly to some degree.
The fucking Mario 64 sample, like on that one, like, are you kidding me? Like it's insane.
And the one thing about Yachty too that I never really enjoyed, but that I've come to kind of understand to a certain extent, is the off-kilter flow. So sort of being offbeat with a lot of different types of rhythms that he's bringing to the table. And then after that, I believe he did Michigan Boy, where it's kind of like doubling down on that, and then you know he went into more of that like Michigan rap type of flow that's very prominent over there. So how do you feel like that adds to the record? Because it's all over it, and to certain times, almost like if he were to use that delivery and that use of autotune, but the melodies would be on point and the flow would be on point, I think it would completely change the dynamic of the record, at least in my opinion, where I would be able to fall in more and more with it, you know?
In a way, I kind of enjoy how kind of raw and in a way like messy it is. You know, there's some records and artists, and again, this goes back to Lil Pump, This goes back to a lot of punk records. This goes back to some underground hip hop artists that kind of blow up overnight, or underground rock artists that blow up overnight, where, it's almost like the fact that they're creating in this space that they have no outside feedback, they have nobody breathing down their neck, they have no audience, they have no self-awareness of what they do. That almost becomes like a strength. But then as soon as what they do kind of eventually gains that audience, it almost becomes like an Eve biting the apple kind of moment. And all of a sudden, like, you're out of the garden now. You're no longer existing in this. At one point, you thought the space that you were originally in was hell. And when in fact, creatively speaking, it wasn't, because, now all of a sudden you have all of these execs and PR people and producers and so on and so forth, like being like, you can't do it like that. You can't do it like that. You can't do this. You can't do that. Or people aren't going to like that. Or all these people on the internet are talking shit about X, Y, and Z. And now we're going to put you in front of this, DJ at a radio station who's going to say to your face, like, you suck and you're trash and you sound like this and you sound like that. Why can't you rap like Biggie? Some shit like that. And like that kind of like very quick, aggressive exposure, especially for people at a very young age, is a lot, and completely destroys your creative process, completely destroys it. Like, there are a lot of people who creatively bounce back, or, find a way to maintain their sound or shift onto something else. But like, especially for people that are such a young age, you have no idea how to process all of that. You know what I mean? How young was he when he came out with that record? He was still a teenager, wasn't he?
He was still a teenager when he came out with that. And I think that there was, like, again, a lot of unfair criticisms with Yachty, because yes, you could speak about maybe, the quality of the raps and like what was coming out with it. But like, there was that whole like Joe Budden segment on Everyday Struggle where it was literally like face to face, like you and I right now, where it's like, you're trash, you're this and you're that. And you really got to feel for the guy in that situation, just because, like, yes, maybe it doesn't make your rotation and it's not speaking to the era that you're coming from, or, what type of stuff that you're enjoying. But, and I don't enjoy the record whatsoever, but like you were saying, that ignorance is bliss sort of moment for an artist, I feel is fucking beautiful, just because, like, you're not thinking about anything. You're just creating, and whatever you want to have comes out, then it stops a lot of shit from happening for you, Like, who knows where, like, Yachty was going to be able to go with his career if Lil Boat dropped, and after that people were just like, okay, it's not for me, but it's fun, people enjoy it. Maybe he upgrades on the stuff that he was doing and drops a better project than Lil Boat, something that's more polished and refined upon. So I also feel like for a lot of artists, it's kind of a hard position to be in, because like that refinement process takes criticism, but only to a certain extent. You can only go so far with that.
Like, so many artists, and this is not specific to hip hop, but so many artists are more obsessed with either making money or growing their profile that they forget about. It's more important to be obsessed about maintaining your artistic bubble, where, whatever is the space that creatively you feel safe making whatever you want inside of it. You know what I mean? If you lose that entirely, you're fucked. Or you're just you're just destined to be in a position where you're constantly beholden to whatever the hell else everybody else thinks.
Exactly. And I'm happy that Yachty's kind of, always kind of known where his place belongs within this modern landscape. And it's cool that his next album apparently is not even going to be hip hop based, so that's going to be exciting. But apparently, speaking about Lil Boat though, I just feel like for an album that's as much as it is about partying and getting lit and this and that, like the energy is kind of lacking for me.
Oh, I disagree with you on that though.
Yeah, I don't think he's as energetic and as charismatic as he could be.
That's kind of like the lead of the whole record, though. What do you mean?
What?
That's kind of like the whole point of the record.
No, I think that's just like his voice and kind of like his cadences are super bubbly and whatever else. But I think that in terms of just the energy, it's kind of lacking a little bit.
Yeah, but the guy's not going to deliver like verse 1 on Mad City, Like, I mean, he does what he can within his artistic bubble, and I think
he just sounds sleepy delivery wise to me.
I can kind of get that, but I mean, like, that's the use of his flow and like kind of how like off flow he is to a certain extent. But like, I mean, to say that like he didn't put energy into the record, or like, it's missing, that sort of thing, as much as I dislike it, like, it is low-key a bit fun to listen to.
I think it's pretty energetic and silly.
Yeah, I think that like that's actually a component that's pretty prominent with that, and is like, it's not taken too seriously. It's not like he's trying to sound like all like gloom and doom. Like, it's really him trying to have fun and bring out a positive light through the music. So I get where you're coming from, but I think that he does that through his flows and cadences, like through his natural ability, like just him as a character as a whole. Like, he's fucking awesome. Like, just the way
Yeah,
that he
he's
portrays
a lovable
himself.
guy.
And
That's what it is.
absolutely, and I think that that's prominent throughout the music. But again, another album where you rated it higher than MBDTF, and nothing was the same. And I could kind of understand where you're coming from now, because it goes on, enjoyability, like from yourself and wherever else you go with it. So that's interesting.
All right, next up we have 2014 Forest Hills Drive by J. Cole, viewed by a big portion of his fan base as his best record. I think that when you're looking at this album, I think it was cool to see the trajectory of J. Cole's career, how he went from being, this kid in North Carolina who really wanted to break out and not have that typical suit and tie job, but also not be, sucked in by the streets. And then the whole album is really just about him reaching that point that he was always chasing after, and then kind of taking some steps back and realizing that he was happier before he had that success and fame and money and whatever else. So musically speaking, I think the singing was a bit of an issue for you. Is there any other components besides that kind of rubbed you the wrong way with 2014?
J. Cole's sort of ability as a rapper at that point as well, in terms of like not just flow and delivery, but just being able to conceptualize tracks that really kind of like dug beneath the surface. I mean, I don't disagree that it is a personal record. And that he does an effective job of sort of like delivering his own personal story. But am I on the edge of my seat to hear that story in the same way that I am like Good Kid, Mad City? No, like absolutely not. Like I feel like J. Cole on that record did a decent job. I just think a lot of the points that he makes are just like a little middle brow, I feel like it could be more interesting. You could do far worse than J. Cole, on that record. And, while a lot of the fans may feel like that record is his best, I feel like his latest record is his best, if not at least like top two.
Does that come down to like rapping ability, let's say, or the performances coming
rapping
through?
Ability, production choices, also just like songwriting as well.
He did step up on the pen game with the offseason though.
But I think you still see that though on 2014. I'm not going to lie to you.
There were also less tracks and less bars and moments where I was just like, it's like I wasn't, and that's kind of the factor, and has been kind of a prominent factor with J. Cole since like literally his first commercial album. It's like you are going to have those couple of songs or those couple of bars where it's like, some almond milk shit or some like, diaper shit or some whatever. And you're just like, oh, Jesus Christ.
You're looking at a big Wet Dreams defender right here. By the way.
Yes, exactly. Or even like, it's even though it is kind of a bit of legitimate hero worship, I still like hear a song like Let Nas Down. I'm like, ugh, like why does this matter? Like, you're a part of a new generation. Like one, who cares? Like number two, I feel like it's a bit too big of a deal to make over of something that you're just hearing secondhand from somebody. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, I heard from somebody that this guy who I hold in high regard thinks I suck. Well, it's like, unless you hear from that guy, because the thing is like, he's just like anybody else. He could have heard anybody's song in passing and been like, whatever. It's like we know as music fans that stuff hits you different ways in different contexts. Maybe that just wasn't the fucking day for Nas to hear your track. What I mean? Maybe if you heard a different song on a different day, he would like it. Not everybody is going to like everything. And to me, for him to kind of drill down into something, I mean, at least it did lead to the remix that has Nas on it, which was kind of cool. But like, still, it's like the idea that I let Nas down. It's like you let him down. Like it's like I don't think Nas was like in bed before your album dropped like, I hope the J. Cole album is okay. I'm not going to get any sleep if J. Cole doesn't pull through with a 10 out of 10.
Yeah, not only that, but he's skillful enough and like has enough praise and has received enough praise to not need one legendary rapper to fuck with him.
Sure, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Like literally, it's okay. So you let Nas down, but like Jay-Z literally puts you on the map, and like Jay-Z like for how many years beefed with him. You know what I mean?
I see where you're coming from. It's like, why does he need that validation?
Right, exactly. At this point, like he has the validation of so many other prominent figures.
Facts.
With it. So okay, so going back into that 2014 track list, a lot of people do enjoy it just because of like, how relatable the content matter could be for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And just going back into that track list example for songs like me, like Fire Squad, or like even like, A Tale of Two Cities.
This is one of the better tracks, Fire Squad.
Absolutely. Like you're gonna be finding top tier J. Cole verses within that. Even like an anthem like No Role Models, like the subject matter within that song is actually pretty deep, going into a place where J. Cole felt like he'd had like no father figure growing up, and where he had gotten to the point where he'd had by himself and through living through life's experiences, and I was seeing that 6 times platinum with that type of message is very impressive. So going to ask you the same question as I did for the other albums. You know, has that score still stuck for you? And has 2014 Forest Hills Drive ever made a push in your rotation? Have you decided to ever pick it up and like find different reasons to like it? Take me through that, you know?
It has not gotten a push. It's not gotten a push. You know, I think the underwhelming moments on the record are just still underwhelming for me. It's not a record that I'm like kind of dying to go back to, you know, but I think J. Cole has gotten better over the years though. I think him and Dreamville collectively have kind of, you know, become like the label and the group to sort of like watch as far as
Absolutely.
like, you know, obviously Kendrick is still Kendrick. And I think he's like got the prominence that he has because of, you know, the amazing work that he's come out with. But like, I feel like he's mostly just kind of decided I'm going to fly solo or just kind of do this weird PG Lang thing. As far as like a collective of artists that are like, you know, as a group kind of getting better and better and more interesting and more intriguing and are probably going to be the next Petri dish for, you know, kind of the next, because we already have JID. You know, and Earth Gang's last record I thought was sounding really good. Yeah. And, you know, who else knows what is going to pop up out of the Dreamville roster in the next couple of years.
Never know.
You know, right now I feel like J. Cole is kind of leading the way with that, and he's kind of the artist to look at. And, you know, as far as like maybe using his position to pick up other people and kind of bring them up and sort of pull them up to create something, you know, that is going to be the next run of albums that we see on the level of a Kendrick or a J. Cole or whatever.
Absolutely. So listen, I think we're going to end it there for today. We ran through a lot of different albums and had a very interesting conversation. Out of all of the albums that I had mentioned to you, so like Swimming, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, 2014, you know, rank them for me, man. If you had to right now, like, would you be able to put a little order through for me? Like, if you wanted to do like personal enjoyment and all these different
Lil Pump is number one. Like,
if I had to rank all, actually, I would put the Yachty over the Pump.
Okay, Yachty over Pump.
Yeah, Lil Boat goes over Lil Pump.
Lil Boat, Lil Pump number two,
and then My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy.
Okay.
And then Swimming, and then we'll say Nothing Was the Same. We'll put Nothing was the same at the bottom.
There we go. There we go.
If I keep listening to Swimming, it may beat out My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. Well,
that's a very interesting take.
That could happen. And we need to make room for Forest. Forest would probably, I don't know if Forest Hill. I mean, I know I scored it higher than Nothing Was the Same.
Aged a bit more poorly for you,
I don't think it's aged poorly.
You have songs like Love Yours on.
Do you remember Love Yours? There may be a couple of tracks off of Nothing Was the Same that grew on me.
Okay, that's good.
I would say I would maybe put Nothing Was the Same up there. Yeah.
Fire. Yep. Okay, so listen, that's it for today, guys. If this is your first time listening to NFR Podcast, please hit the subscribe button. We're doing content like this on a daily basis. Thank you so much, Anthony, for coming through today. It was a fantastic recording. And listen, if there's anything you guys disagree with, either on Lou and I's end or even like Anthony, let us know in the comment section. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.